Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Racism is evil. The words of President Trump as he attempted to silence the critics who accused him of moral failure by not explicitly condemning white supremacists and neo-Nazis after a deadly weekend of protests in Charlottesville, Virginia. Heather Heyer was killed and 19 others were injured after a car ploughed into a crowd of protesters marching against a far-right rally. The man charged with her murder has this morning been refused bail. Here's our Washington correspondent, Kylie Morris, and a warning: her report contains distressing scenes.
From the moment he stepped back onto White House grounds, there's been a yearning to hear the president call out neo-Nazis, the KKK and white supremacists. He couldn't hear the shouted questions on the lawn. Mr. President, one reporter called, do you condemn all white supremacists? But the message reached him finally only an hour ago when he broke his silence after strong criticism from within his own party.
Racism is evil, and those who cause violence in its name are criminals and thugs, including the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups that are repugnant to everything we hold dear as Americans.
It was the third attempt by the White House to find the words to respond to this horror.
Cars just ran down all of these people.
The scene after a car was driven at fatal speed toward protesters demonstrating against an extreme right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. More on the 20-year-old driver in a moment. First, the woman he's charged with murdering, 32-year-old Heather Heyer, a paralegal who worked in the town. Friends gathered at a memorial for her last night. They say she was strong-willed and stood up for social justice. In her last social media post, she wrote, "If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention."
I'm very sad. I'm very, very sad. But I can't be angry, because angry will make me hate, and hate only leads to more hate. And there's just no point to that. Heather wouldn't have wanted that either.
20-year-old James Alex Fields Jr. was denied bail when he appeared via video link in court today, charged with second-degree murder. He's originally from Kentucky, where one of his teachers recalled a bright but misguided student with radical convictions on race and enthralled by Adolf Hitler. Before his arrest, he was caught on video at the Charlottesville rally. He's in the middle of the screen carrying a shield with a neo-Nazi emblem. Which all explains the pressure that built on the president to denounce the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists, and why it matters that on the day of Heather Heyer's death, he instead condemned violence on many sides and dodged direct questions.
Mr. President, do you want the support of these white nationalist groups who say they support you, Mr. President? Mr. President,
that choice drew applause on neo-Nazi sites. The Daily Stormer wrote, "Really, really good. God bless him." So what will they think of this?
We are a nation founded on the truth that all of us are created equal. We are equal under the law, and we are equal under our Constitution. Those who spread violence in the name of bigotry strike at the very core of America.
This is a late call by a president who, during his campaign, was accused of giving succor to the hard right and missed opportunities to de-link his politics from theirs.
And I'm Ken Frazier. I'm chairman and CEO of Merck.
It's already cost him at least one high-profile ally. Ken Frazier, the CEO of one of America's biggest pharmaceutical companies, resigned from the president's manufacturing council, saying he felt responsibility to take a stand against intolerance and extremism.
And let me remind
Other Republican leaders have in the past found it more straightforward to call out the extreme right.
And the exits, which are clearly marked, are for you to walk out of as I stand this ground without compromise.
Former presidential candidate Bob Dole, and that shining beacon of conservatism, Ronald Reagan himself.
To those groups who still adhere to senseless racism and religious prejudice, you are the ones who are out of step with our society, You are the ones who willfully violate the meaning of the dream that is America.
When the organiser of the Charlottesville rally tried to seize the podium himself on Sunday and blame the police for what had happened, he was chased away by protesters.
No KKK! No fascists!
This may not be a conversation the president wants to have, but he's having it now. The protesters who marched yesterday and will again today in Seattle, Chicago, countless other cities and towns demand it should be so. On one level, I think it is worth observing that it is news that the US president says that racism is evil and denounces neo-Nazis. But that's where we are. There has been real political damage done here beyond the horrible human damage of what happened in Charlottesville. Speaking to senior Republicans today, they've been telling me that they're disappointed, they're upset that the president failed to speak out more rapidly, to respond more directly and disavow these groups. He's been under this kind of pressure before, remember, during the campaign. It's very clear that these groups see themselves as part of his base. They're certainly his supporters. He didn't distance himself from them during the campaign. So this statement that he's just made is significant in the sense that it goes further than any such statements have gone before. He's certainly made it clearer than it was before. But I think for many, this statement comes really too late. It should have been made earlier. After all, this is the plain-speaking, non-politician president. This is the guy who calls it like it is. So there are very real questions about why he can't speak plainly about this. You know, I think the day that President Trump was elected, there were real questions about how would he handle twin challenges, a domestic instance of racial violence here in the US and some kind of a standoff with a nuclear power, an enemy abroad. We're now in that moment with Charlottesville and North Korea, and now we get to see how it turns out.
Kylie, thanks very much. Well, joining us now from New York is Casey Michel, a journalist who covers the far right, and from Charlotte in North Carolina, the artist and civil rights activist Bree Newsom, who in 2015 climbed the flagpole in front of the South Carolina Capitol building and lowered the Confederate flag. The flag was originally raised in 1951 as a statement of opposition, 61 rather, as a statement of opposition to the civil rights movement at the time. The massacre of 9 black parishioners 2 years ago by a white supremacist in Charleston registered controversy over South Carolina's flag. Let's talk to them both. Let's go to you, Bree Newsom, first, if I may. So you heard President Trump's very clear words, albeit 48 hours late. Do they convince you?
Well, thank you for having me join. The problem is words are never as powerful as action. And the longer that it takes to speak words that need to be spoken, the less powerful they become. So, yes, 48 hours later, he has said key words that people have been asking him to say for the past 48 hours. But what really matters is what action is going to be taken to address racism in this nation. And until we really see concrete action, until we see a real change in behavior, the words are going to ring hollow.
Well, what concrete action, what words would you like him to say, to take, in order to dispel these doubts?
Well, it would honestly require a complete change of the agenda. I think it's really important to understand what has been happening in the past several years in the United States of America. In 2008, we had the election of the first black president. That was a moment of hope and enthusiasm in a lot of ways for the nation, but it also led to the spurning of a lot of hate groups. We've had a spike in white supremacist groups. We've had an increase in hate crimes. That was increasing during the Obama administration, and it's only gotten worse with the election of Donald Trump. And you have to remember, as it was mentioned in the story leading up to this, Trump's campaign was marked by overtly racist overtones. He announced his campaign by accusing Mexico of sending rapists. He referred to Mexican immigrants as being mainly rapists, which is an overtly racist statement. And the policies that have been enacted since the Trump administration has come into power has only been consistent with those racist overtones. We have seen an increase in attacks on immigrants and people of color.
Okay, let's go to Casey Michel in New York. Casey, you're an expert on the far right, on the alt-right in the United States. I mean, what will they make of Donald Trump's, clarification, as it were, that points the finger directly at them?
Well, I think that the key within this is something that Bree just mentioned. There was a 48-hour period that President Trump had to wait between the incident in Charlottesville and his statement today. And even that statement today, yes, it talked about the KKK. Yes, it talked about neo-Nazis and white supremacists, but it didn't mention the alt-right, of which James Field, the alleged terrorist behind the car plowing into protesters in Charlottesville, was a member. The alt-right, as far as anyone can tell, may be dissuaded potentially by the statement today. The likelihood of that happening, though, is minuscule, at least at this point. President Trump's statement was far too little, far too late. He should have come out far stronger on Saturday. He swung and missed, unlike many of his Republican colleagues who did come out and say this was domestic terrorism. Ted Cruz, Jeff Sessions. Right. President Trump missed an opportunity to bring the country together, missed an opportunity to distance himself from the alt-right.
But are you saying that if you're a member of the Ku Klux Klan, if you're David Duke, you might be upset by what Trump had to say today, but if you're a member of the alt-right, someone like Steve Bannon, who after all sits in the West Wing of the White House, then you won't be too upset?
No, and again, as Bree said, it would require President Trump having a complete about-face of the groups he's cultivated, of the rhetoric he has pushed, and of the type of leadership he has shown over the past few months and even through the campaign itself. He has cultivated these groups. He has kept Steve Bannon, who described his own Breitbart website as a platform for the alt-right, close to him. Steve Bannon is still in the White House. Others who are associated with far-right groups, both within the U.S. and abroad, are still within the White House. President Trump's statement, again, is 2 days too late. It did not come nearly forcefully enough.
Bree, there are many Americans who disagree with, who are appalled by what happened in Charlottesville this weekend, who will welcome the president's words today, but who also feel that they, and a lot of them are white males, have been overlooked by Washington, by New York. They have found a voice in Donald Trump. How can you have a conversation with those people without thinking of them as racist?
Well, I think there's a reality of an economic struggle that many people are feeling in this country. That's working people of all races. Unfortunately, there is a long history in this nation of political leaders like Donald Trump using race as a wedge. So instead of honestly addressing the economic issues that are facing all Americans, they, find scapegoats, blaming the immigrants, blaming migrants for being the reason that people are out of work or that people are struggling, instead of, having honest leadership and really bringing the country together and finding solutions that impact all of us. So, the grievances, the economic grievances that people feel are very real. The attacks on people of color and blaming immigrants and people of color is not.
Casey Michelle, we talk about neo-Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan. How big are these groups? How many thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people are we talking about?
Well, that's a great question. There is no official membership when it comes to something like the alt-right. Individuals can show up, individuals can turn, individuals can join whenever they would like. As it pertains to someone like James Fields, though, the alleged terrorist, this is something that's been brewing for years. We've seen his high school teacher say that when he was back in high school, he expressed sympathy for white supremacists, white nationalists, and Nazis. We saw on James Fields' Facebook that he had posted pro-Trump material, even an image of Trump as king, which again points to the linkages between the alt-right and Trump. We don't have firm numbers, but this is a president who has cultivated these groups, and again, whose statement today does little to distance himself and his administration from those groups on the ground, which look to the president and see their numbers potentially growing.
Casey Michelle and Bree Newsom, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, away from his domestic difficulties, tension between North Korea and the United States continued to simmer. Earlier, I spoke to US Admiral James Stavridis, the NATO Supreme Allied Commander for Europe until 2013. I began by asking him if President Trump's tweets and comments about the crisis had been helpful.
No, not at all. In fact, they've been hurtful. What they have contributed to is a kind of an upward spiral of violent rhetoric between the United States and North Korea. And let's face it, when leaders increase rhetoric, military planners have to follow. So your military forces come closer and closer to a hair trigger. Very dangerous situation. It's time to dial down the rhetoric, increase the surveillance, increase the international cooperation, work on the sanctions, increase the missile defense.
So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most critical, how dangerous is the situation at the moment?
I'd say it's about a 6. What's important to note is that 3 months ago, I would have said it was only a 3. So we've effectively doubled the level of threat. But we're still a long way from an active exchange of military hardware. Anyone involved in this who is not working to denuclearize the North Korean peninsula is part of the problem. China is part of the problem. They have a significant level of influence over North Korea. Kim Jong-un is the heart of the problem. The American attitude, as expressed by President Trump, is certainly one that is contributing to overheated rhetoric. So there's plenty of challenge to go around. What we need is a better collective approach to solve it.
Is there even a coherent policy towards North Korea? A rational, coherent policy coming out of the White House as far as you can detect it?
I don't think so. At the moment, there seem to be competing approaches coming from State Department, which is much more, as you would expect, oriented toward diplomacy. The Pentagon, which is in the business of creating military options. The White House, where we see the president speaking in these apocalyptic tones.
I mean, I guess one of the dangers in all this is that we often describe Kim Jong-un as an irrational leader, but there is a rationale to what they're trying to do, isn't there?
Kim Jong-un, I think, is well named. Kim Jong-un. He's unpredictable, but he is not irrational. Within the construct that he has grown up in, the shark tank in which he was raised, he has learned that he needs nuclear weapons to remain in power. He watched what happened to Saddam Hussein. He watched what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. And with that rational construct of needing nuclear weapons, Kim Jong-un's moves are rational. They can be unpredictable because of timing. He will jump forward and jump back, but that's different than being irrational. We ought to be able to understand that and apply it as we construct our strategy. And frankly, we spend far too much time in these conversations discussing North Korea and China and the United States as though South Korea were not fundamentally part of this equation. We need to spend more time listening and paying attention to the needs and the views of South Korea, which are very much toward reconciliation and diplomacy.
Has America under President Trump, let me ask you honestly, become a force of instability in the world?
I don't think the United States is a force for instability, but I would certainly say that the more we rely on traditional American values of respect for international law, of approaching our problems diplomatically, of using military force as a final resort, the more we will succeed. And I'm certainly available to offer free courses for anyone from the Trump administration.
Do they need it?
We all need it. But I would say that in today's White House, working more with traditional law and diplomatic tools would be of benefit.
Admiral Stavridis, thank you very much indeed.
Elsewhere, though, President Trump this evening condemned the neo-Nazis, KKK members and activists from other hate groups who sparked the violence this weekend in Charlottesville, Virginia, one of America's largest recent public gatherings of white supremacists. The trouble led to the death of anti-fascist campaigner Heather Heyer and left 19 others injured. Today's remarks were, you might think, a standard presidential statement under the circumstances. Yet it took Mr. Trump 2 days to reach a position where he was prepared to speak out against the far-right elements whose support, some believe, helped him into the White House. Were his words too little too late? How significant is the extreme right in America? And has Trump created the conditions in which the movement might grow? Gabriel Gatehouse has been examining the aftermath of a shocking weekend, and his report contains some strong language.
They came to Charlottesville prepared for confrontation.
Blood and soil! Blood and soil!
And it wasn't long before they got it. The Unite the Right protesters included neo-Nazis and members of the Ku Klux Klan. They brought shields and helmets, clubs and guns. By mid-afternoon, one woman was dead, killed by a speeding car, allegedly driven by a man described as having an interest in Nazi Germany. White supremacists were condemned by nearly everybody, but not the president.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides.
A neo-Nazi website interpreted this statement as a tacit declaration of support. What might have been a tragic but isolated incident of political violence has become an existential question about where America is headed.
The far right that we're talking about here believes that white people in the United States are being, quote unquote, dispossessed. So when they heard Trump talk about building a wall, when they heard him talk about Mexicans being criminals and rapists, when he retweeted somebody whose Twitter handle was called White Genocide, these were all things that thrilled them, that energized them, that made them believe that Donald Trump was one of them, or that he at least spoke for them.
This event has been declared an unlawful assembly.
The authorities in Charlottesville were taken aback by how fast the violence spread. The governor of Virginia said the right-wing protesters were better armed than the police. The counter-demonstrators seemed less well-armed, but no less angry, and, say witnesses on the right, no less prepared to use violence.
Look out there yourself for footage of these rallies and these marches and see who strikes first. Now, that doesn't excuse any behavior on either side. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying if we want to have a full and frank conversation about this, we have to realize that these are both extremist factions.
America is not newly divided. The protest in Charlottesville was ostensibly called in defense of a statue to a Confederate general. Their torchlit procession was reminiscent of the Klan gatherings of a previous era. America has changed since then, but not perhaps as much as 8 years of an Obama presidency might suggest.
Black quarterbacks on the team of white supremacy hasn't helped us.
On the eve of Donald Trump's inauguration, I met Silky Slim, a community activist in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The KKK, he told me then, had never really gone away. Even so, today, he is taken aback by the vehemence with which it's raised its head.
When we talked to y'all back then, when you came here, one of the things that we really didn't understand, the language where people were asking us when they came from England and France and other places, do you think this is going to be a race war? We were like, no, we are fighting against injustice. But now we definitely see a race war on the horizon here in America. They're not even hiding behind their hoods anymore. So with Trump in office, they think that this is something that they can bring to the forefront, and America have to accept it. It's a very crazy time right here in America right now.
Under pressure, Donald Trump today condemned white supremacy more directly than ever before.
Racism is evil, and those who cause violence in its name are criminals and thugs, including the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups that are repugnant to everything we hold dear as Americans.
But in Charlottesville and elsewhere, there are those who fear his presidency has unleashed forces many thought consigned to history and opened wounds that the passage of time has not yet healed.
Joining me now from New York are the conservative commentator Ann Coulter and Ellis Coase, a fellow of the American Civil Liberties Union and author of multiple books exploring race in America. If I could come to you first, Ann, thank you for coming onto the programme today. Donald Trump called a press conference today in which he explicitly condemned members of the KKK, neo-Nazis. He knew he'd done something wrong in not explicitly condemning those groups before, didn't he?
No, I don't think so. I think there are just different factions that were so heavily, I mean, the Republican Party in Washington, which hates Trump, was pushing him to do it. I don't think he should have. And to give your viewers a more accurate description of what happened, i.e. the New York Times report, one of their most liberal reporters, Cheryl Gay Stolberg, no, the violence was coming from both sides. In fact, it was New York militia members doing a better job than the police. The police were told to stand down by Democrats. This country has been roiled by left-wing violence for more than a year now.
Sorry, Ann Coulter, if I could just interrupt there. If I could just interrupt for a moment. It is a false equivalence to say left-wing violence was the same as fascist white supremacists coming together, walking in jackboots, holding guns, saying, "You will not, in our name, you will not defeat us, Jews will not replace us," shouting all sorts of hateful slogans. They started this rally, they created this rally, and it's the largest group of white supremacists with their faces clearly shown in recent years in America. It is not the same, is it, as anti-fascist protesters coming together?
No, absolutely wrong. The quote anti-fascist, other than the names, the labels you put on them, the quote anti-fascist protesters burnt down Berkeley twice to prevent people like me and college professors from speaking because they don't like them. They've shut down a parade in Portland, a Rose Parade that's gone on for years because the local Republicans were going to march. No conservative can speak at a college campus these days because the quote anti-fascists come to town and smash windows and beat people up. And by the way, the one actual legal difference as opposed to a label you're going to put on them was that these alleged Nazis, some were, some weren't. There were a few Nazis, I guess. I mean, I'm not one of them, but that wasn't all it was. They had a permit to speak, and they were never allowed to speak.
Let me bring in Ellis Coase.
Anti-fascist disrupted a legal gathering.
Let me bring in Ellis Coase. Welcome to the programme. Ellis, Donald Trump has clearly condemned the KKK today, perhaps late, you would say. Has he done enough? Has he done enough?
Well, he's done all he's going to do, I think. I mean, Anna's right. I mean, you're right, rather, in saying that they had a permit. And one of the reasons that they had a permit is because the ACLU stood up for them to get them a permit. So I think we need to separate the whole question of freedom of speech from what that speech entailed and what they encouraged and what they created out there. And I think the problem is that you had a group of white racists who fomented a race riot, basically. And it's no way around that. And the fact that the president took 2 days to speak to it is ridiculous. It's a little bit like a witness or anyone who sees something taking, instead of making an immediate statement, speaking 2 days after being beat up, and then finally, yielding and saying, "Okay, I'll do it." And even when he spoke out, he also mixed his message up by saying that he was thinking of pardoning Sheriff Arpaio from Arizona, who basically was convicted of racial profiling, and slamming Ken Frazier, the black CEO who resigned to object to his lack of fortitude in speaking to this before. So clearly, Donald Trump has a problem when it comes to dissociating himself from virulent racists in America. And no American president should have that problem, but because they're such a big part of his base, he has to try to accommodate them. And I think that's
Ellis, let's come on
tragic.
to that. Thank you for that. Let me bring in Anne again. David Duke, the former KKK leader who was at the march, said, I quote, "We are going to fulfill the promises of Donald Trump." Why are these people doing it in Donald Trump's name? And is that the real reason why he refused to explicitly condemn them in the immediate aftermath of that riot?
No, you're not responsible for the people who endorse you. And if we're talking about how long it takes for a condemnation, Black Lives Matter's activists or sympathizers are responsible for killing 10 cops last year. 10 I can think of off the top of my head.
And how
2
many,
in New
how
York,
many
3
people,
in Louisiana,
how many
5
black people lost
Dallas.
their lives, Ann Coulter, in America last year?
Why wasn't Obama asked to denounce that? Why didn't Obama denounce that? Why wasn't he ever even asked to denounce that?
Black Lives Matter did not kill 10 cops. That just happens to be a slur and incorrect. It's a flat-out lie.
Well, okay, neither did the Klan.
That's a flat-out lie.
This guy who drove a car, and I might add, we don't even know if this was intentional.
That's a flat-out lie. But the problem is that these are people.
No, it isn't.
The problem is that these are people who are part of Trump's base. So he has a very difficult time disassociating himself from them, as odious as their thoughts may be.
Hillary had Black Lives Matter speakers at her convention. I promise you, Donald Trump is not going to have David Duke at his convention.
In a true expression of freedom of speech, you're both talking at the same time. Thank you very much for being on Newsnight this evening.
Now, Donald Trump has had a pretty bad week. He needs to find solace. Where does he go? To the floors above the clouds of a skyscraper bearing his name in supersized golden letters. Donald Trump is spending another night at his old home in Manhattan, Trump Tower. But that's only one reason why Kylie Morris is in New York with him. Kylie, what's with the trucks behind you?
The trucks are behind me, I'm guessing because there is a swell of media here. Obviously, people are very excited that some people are very excited that Donald Trump has returned to Manhattan. This is one of his first longer trips back to New York since he was elected president. But as you were saying, you know, it's only Tuesday and already this is quite a bad week for the president. A Gallup poll taken at the weekend that's just come out today has revealed that he is at a 34% approval rating. That is one of the lowest ratings for any president's past at this point in their term of office, and certainly it's a new low for Donald Trump. He has now repudiated the racist right after the killing of a protester in Charlottesville at the weekend, but I'm afraid comments and tweets he's made since doing that have created a sense that he did that only potentially because of political pressure. Certainly we are at 4 and counting when it comes to the number of CEOs from his advisory body, the Manufacturing Council, who have walked away from him because of this. This is new, a corporate backlash. CEOs from big companies like Merck Pharmaceuticals and Intel calling out the president on this. Now, in a short time, we'll be hearing from Anthony Scaramucci, a fellow traveller and ally of Donald Trump, and briefly his communications director. But first, our report on Donald Trump's return to Manhattan. Donald Trump may once have thought if he can make it here, he can make it anywhere. But anywhere is proving a challenge. Even in Manhattan's sacred Trump soil, they chanted "New York hates you" and "Shame on you" as his motorcade glided by. They'd begun to gather in the afternoon, many angered by President Trump's delayed condemnation of right-wing hate groups after the terror attack that killed a protester in Charlottesville on Saturday.
What he believes in, stands for, completely un-American.
My grandparents went from Nazi-occupied Romania to Israel and then came to the States, but this is not what my grandparents came here for.
Racism is evil, and those who cause violence in its name are criminals and thugs.
His presidential statement shunning white supremacists yesterday was quickly overtaken.
Mr. President, can you explain why you did not condemn those hate groups by name over the weekend?
They've been condemned. They have been condemned.
He found a quicker retort for those he calls the fake news media than he had for the neo-Nazis themselves.
Can we ask you some more questions, sir?
It doesn't bother me at all, but I like real news, not fake news. You're fake news.
And then there was this, retweeting an image of the Trump train running over a CNN journalist. Quickly deleted and tweeted in error, the White House says, but the president had lost the moral high ground in less than a New York minute. For what it's worth, even alt-right provocateurs at hastily arranged backroom press conferences don't believe he's against them.
I just don't take it seriously. It just sounded so hollow and vapid.
There were no white supremacists on hand late yesterday in Durham, North Carolina, to protest against the toppling of a Confederate statue. The images may be reminiscent of Saddam in 2003, but this is a battle with a much longer history. In preparation for another kind of battle, possible confrontation with a nuclear enemy in North Korea, US Marines began parachute drop drills in the largest scale military exercises ever held between the US and Japan. Pyongyang today released photos of Kim Jong-un reviewing plans for a nuclear-armed missile strike on Guam, but quoted the dear leader as saying he'll bide his time before ordering any launch, opting instead, he says, to watch a little more of the foolish and stupid conduct of the Yankees. Supporters will call this a victory for Donald Trump's fire and fury threats, but it's difficult to know what's prompted Pyongyang's bout of self-restraint and whether or not to believe it. For a moment, it fell to Anthony Scaramucci to manage Donald Trump's message when it came to North Korea and just about everything else. But of course, that fellow New Yorker suffered a kind of neck-breakingly rapid fall from grace. He no longer holds that position. But Inigo Gilmore has been on the trail of the mooch and has this report.
Some called him a political suicide bomber. He's known as the Mooch. His whirlwind rise and fall has been a gift for American satirists.
You got a little bump on me, I made you feel excited, but I was out of your system too quick.
But he's back, starring in his own sequel, Anthony Scaramucci, The Mooch, The Comeback. As guests lined up for the Stephen Colbert Show in Manhattan last night, it was Mooch Mania.
Do you like him? Are you a fan? Tell me.
Pretty excited, yeah.
Cult figure in America?
Bit of a comic figure, I think, in America.
Comic figure?
Yeah.
Where was the Mooch? Suddenly he popped up at a side entrance.
Mr. Scaramucci, have you spoken to President Trump?
I have spoken.
What do you say to him? Is he missing you?
I don't know if he's missing me. I'm missing him. How's that?
You're missing him? Are you going to make a comeback? Is this the comeback?
You never know. You never know.
We're back. On the show, Scaramucci was asked about his spectacular fall from grace.
Do you feel burned or backstabbed?
Not at all.
Really?
Well, let me put it this way. When you take a job like that, Stephen, you know that your expiration date is coming. I didn't think I was going to last too long, but I thought I'd last longer than like a carton of milk. I just didn't last that long. Okay.
You were like,
but I mean, you know,
you were like a bag of raw shrimp.
You bought your eggs and you were cooking them the day I got fired. It was totally fine, right?
Afterwards, I caught up with the Mooch once again.
Anthony, you said you spoke to President Trump the other day. What did you say to him?
Well, I always have kept, despite my fiasco and my mistake, I always keep my presidential conversations on.
But have you told him to get rid of Steve Bannon? Have you advised him?
I think I've been pretty open about the situation with Steve Bannon. So.
Have you told him it's time to go?
It was time for him to go, hustled away by a minder, whisked off to his next pressing appointment. The Mooch is a pretty big deal now. I wondered what people in his own home area in Long Island made of all this. His working-class father worked in a sand mine near here, and the local pizzeria remembers the Mooch fondly.
Oh yeah, once in a while he used to come by for a slice.
Yeah? What was he like? Was he friendly?
Yeah, he was friendly, nice guy.
What's his favorite pizza?
I think the plain pizza.
Oh, straightforward plain?
Yeah, straightforward, regular slice.
Plain pizza, plain talking.
Yes.
But the Mooch's plain talking, rather like the titles showing at the local cinema, has unnerved some of the proud Italian Americans in the local community.
Do they like him here?
It depends with whom you're speaking.
Depends with whom you're speaking?
Yes.
What about you?
No.
Why not?
Potty mouth.
Potty mouth?
Yes.
You think he's got bad language?
Disgusting.
Down the road, I found Scaramucci's uncle cruising around on a classic motorcycle. Sal, a World War II veteran, is now in his 90s.
When Anthony lost that job, were you upset? Were you disappointed?
We all lose and come back.
We all lose and come back? So he's making the comeback now.
He did not want to be drawn on the comeback. He showed me photos from his old motorbike shop, where his young nephew worked for him, as his cousin recalls.
He was his first job.
Yeah,
He
that's
learned
right.
From him.
In the motorcycle shop.
Yeah, right there.
What do you think he learned?
He learned how to bullshit.
Learned how to what?
Bullshit. No.
A short time later, a friend who's known the family for 50 years appeared. Ed had a warning for the Mooch.
He ruined himself with his mouth. So he's an aggressive guy.
He said he needs to learn to control himself.
Aggressive, tough guy. So he let his, emotions get. He's got to learn control.
But what now for Anthony Scaramucci, and what of his comeback? We talked to a journalist who knows him well.
So he said he was going to go quiet. I don't think he's going quiet. He travels in so many worlds so well, between the finance, the media. He's dabbled into politics. He admitted to learning some rough lessons there. Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more of him on TV. TV is a great platform for him. If it would be a talk show he would do, if he would kind of continue to kind of skirt between these three worlds.
So we're going to be seeing a lot more of the Mooch, you think?
Absolutely. Yeah, he was known very well in New York, and I think the rest of the country is going to get to know him much better now.
Whether Americans like it or not, the Mooch, whose White House antics brought about such a rapid fall, is on the rise again. Well, so long as his potty mouth does not get in the way.
So Anthony Scaramucci discovering life after the White House, even though he's no longer part of the inner circle there. We are now, though, hearing from the inner circle there's a chance that President Trump will be holding some kind of a press event, potentially another press conference this afternoon. Will he try again, this time for the fourth time, to repudiate the racist right, the neo-Nazis who were involved in organising the rally down in Charlottesville when that protester was tragically killed? Or will he talk about infrastructure, which is what he's been meeting on today and wants to talk about? For now, we'll find out very shortly. Thank you. Back to you in the studio.
We will indeed. Thanks, Kylie.
President Trump, he has been holding a press conference insisting that both sides were to blame for violence in Virginia, which left one person dead. The president widely criticised for his initial response to Saturday's clashes, which failed to denounce the far right and blamed all sides. And that is a position he restated yesterday evening in a combative press conference, leading to renewed outcry and dissent, even from his own side. Cordelia Lynch reports now from New York.
A structured start to what quickly became a fiery, emotional ad-lib. A frustrated Donald Trump changing gear, defending far-right protesters in Charlottesville.
You had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists, okay? And the press has treated them absolutely unfairly. Now, in the other group also, you had some fine people, but you also had troublemakers, and you see them come with the black outfits, and with the helmets and with the baseball bats. You had a lot of bad people in the other group too.
A day before, at the White House reading from a script, he condemned white nationalists, singling out the groups other members of his party already had. But back home in New York, he took aim at what he sees as the other side.
What about the alt-left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt-right? Do they have any semblance of guilt?
He denounced the driver accused of killing Heather Heyer, but avoided definitions.
Driver of the car is a disgrace to himself, his family, and this country. And that is, you can call it terrorism, you can call it murder, you can call it whatever you want.
But President Trump insisted many were there to simply oppose a Confederate statue being taken down, before asking what next.
This week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week, and is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop?
This was a press conference for the history books. If the president's remarks on Monday were what his advisors wanted him to say, this was an unfiltered look at what he really feels. The concern is that it might undo his efforts to try and calm the waters.
More senior business leaders have left his manufacturing council, and senior Republicans were left clamoring to clarify their positions. The Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, tweeted, "We must be clear, white supremacy is repulsive. This bigotry is counter to all this country stands for. There can be no moral ambiguity." Outside Trump Tower, more evidence of a deepening divide and the instant impact of an unorthodox leader who gave a window into what he really believes. It was a candid, impromptu moment that could define his presidency. Cordelia Lynch, Sky News, New York.